This is a story about a devious little Portuguese prince rebelling against his father, a story of love and betrayal that culminates with Portugal's very first corpse queen. Yeah, no joke. This is the story of the love that bound Dom Pedro I and Dona Inês de Castro. Now, to preface this story, I have to mention that this is one of the most popular stories of Portuguese literature and culture, as it is basically Portugal's version of Romeo and Juliet if it was written by George R.R. Martin. Our story starts in 1336. King Dom Afonso IV of Portugal intended to strengthen the relations between the Kingdom of Portugal with the Kingdom of Castile, and so he arranged the marriage of his son and heir, Prince Dom Pedro, with a Castilian princess, Dona Constança Manuel. Dom Pedro would perform his husbandly duties and would have 3 kids with Dona Constança, but he would fall in love with Dona Inês de Castro, his wife's maid of honor, a noble lady from Galicia. King Dom Afonso would ignore his relations with her, seeing as every Portuguese prince and king with less than 3 bastards was considered a fucking loser. But when Dona Constança Manuel dies in 1349, Dom Pedro intends to marry Dona Inês de Castro, his lover. The king disapproves, and we assume that it is because he was afraid that her influence on the prince would damage the fragile peace between Portugal and Castile. Dom Pedro does not give up on his intentions, so the king forces Dona Inês to exile, which does not work because Dom Pedro smuggled her back into Portugal and hid her in the Santa Clara convent, where they would live together for a few years. The king then decides to make a stand and orders the execution of Dona Inês, taking advantage of a situation where Dom Pedro was absent. Not cool, Dad. Dona Inês was executed by 3 advisors of the king who stabbed her. It is said that, to this day, her blood can still be seen in the Fountain of Tears at the Santa Clara convent, and her screams can be heard at night. Dom Pedro was not about to take his father's shit, and he declares open rebellion against him. The conflict would not materialize in a war only because Dom Pedro's mother, Dona Beatriz of Castile, would mediate a peace between the two. In 1357, King Dom Afonso IV dies, and Dom Pedro ascends the Portuguese throne. For 3 years he kept his silence on the matter, but in 1360 he summoned the noblemen of Portugal to declare that, in the year of 1353, he married Dona Inês in secrecy. He declares their 3 kids to be legitimate and eligible for the line of succession. He also declares his father's advisors traitors and their life forfeit, their hearts to be ripped out of their chests, as his own heart had been symbolically. Moreover, he declares Dona Inês as the Queen of Portugal. Her body was to be moved from the convent of Santa Clara, where she had been buried, to the Alcobaça monastery, to be buried in a magnificent tomb worthy of a queen, where, upon his death, Dom Pedro would join her in eternity. Not only was her body to be moved, but crowned, in a ceremony where the Portuguese noblemen were to kiss her hand and declare their love and fealty to the Portuguese queen. This happened in the 14th century, so this last decree was sacrilege, profane, a humiliation of the Portuguese nobles, and an unprecedented act of lunacy. This is an amazing love story. It's so amazing and unbelievable. It's almost like this could not have happened. Yeah, I don't mean to be the raccoon standing between this lovely couple and true love, but what I just told you is the legend of their love, not a factual historical account of it. I will now make an historiographical analysis of this story to try and separate fact from fiction. We can divide the evolution of this story in 3 phases. Phase 1. A declaration of marriage and love. The story becomes a relevant political event in Portugal when Dom Pedro declared to have married Dona Inês de Castro. In this phase of the story, their marriage is a fact held in high respect by kingly decree. Their kids are seen as legitimate princes of the crown without any hint of challenge. In his 1360 declaration, Dom Pedro does order the execution of his father's advisors, but the method of execution is not described in the historical sources of this period. The order to move her body to the Alcobaça monastery and his body joining her in death is a fact. He did order this and it happened. They lay resting in their joint tomb to this day. The ceremony in which her body was to be transported to the Alcobaça monastery is described as a grand ceremony, but there's no mention of a crowning or nobleman kissing her bony fingers. This version of events is based on first-hand accounts, the testimony of people who either witnessed the marriage, the declaration, or lived close to the time of these events. Phase 2: Dynastic Crisis and Rewriting History. In 1385, the Portuguese succession enters a crisis. When Dom Pedro dies in 1367, his eldest surviving son by his first marriage, Dom Fernando, ascends the throne. But in 1383, Dom Fernando dies without an heir. The laws of succession dictated that the succession should pass to the eldest legitimate brother of Dom Fernando, which happened to be Dom João de Portugal, the eldest son of Dom Pedro and Dona Inês de Castro. Dom João de Portugal was exiled in Castile at the time because his relations with his elder brother, the king, had hit a breaking point of tension. When his brother dies, he presses his claim to the throne, but the Portuguese nobles were not fans of his and saw him as an outsider, a pretender supported by the enemy kingdom of Castile. They favored another son of Dom Pedro, Dom João Mestre de Avis. According to the law, they could not pass over Dom João de Portugal, as his claim was stronger, since he was not a bastard like Dom João Mestre de Avis was. They decided then to rewrite history. The King's Chronicle, Fernão Lopes, was tasked with rewriting the history of the marriage of Dom Pedro and Dona Inês de Castro to reflect that the marriage held no validity according to canonical law. It is pointed out that they were third-degree cousins, and that was one cause for the marriage to be declared void and null. Yeah, I forgot to mention that all Iberian princes, princesses, and nobles in general were basically second, third, and fourth-degree cousins, and to marry each other they needed a special license from the Pope. I'm sorry for the jump scare I just caused anyone living in the southern states of the US. This license was never granted to the union between Pedro and Inês. Moreover, even though Pedro declared their kids as legitimate, Pope Innocentius VI had refused to legitimize them in the eyes of the Church. This was enough for the Portuguese nobles to portray Dom João de Portugal as another bastard, with a claim as strong as Dom João Mestre de Avis, and so the choice between the two bastard sons would come down to which candidate the Portuguese court preferred, which happened to be Dom João Mestre de Avis. The story of the marriage between Pedro and Inês was rewritten 20 years later to legitimize the plans the nobles had for the succession. Fernão Lopes, the king's chronicler, would then make use of history as a propaganda tool, changing the elements of the story as he needed to provide the nobles the outcome they wanted. In the second version of the story, their marriage becomes a mere love story between two lovers who could not be together, whose union stood against the laws of the realm. The institutional and legal fact of the marriage, confirmed by King Dom Pedro himself, is supplanted by a romantic story of forbidden love that transformed the next heir into a bastard with no right of primogeniture. Beyond this, the Fernão Lopes version of events also adds the method of execution of the advisors with their hearts ripped from their chests. Both this element of forbidden love and the dramatic execution of the advisors are missing in earlier accounts, which present the story in a more sober tone, speaking to a legal and institutional fact rather than a narrative of unsanctioned love. These fantastical elements were perhaps added to distract those who still remembered the king's declaration, which could now be reinterpreted as a desperate attempt to honor his late lover, taken from him in an act of cruelty. The question of their marriage being valid or not, and the question of the 1385 succession having been stolen or not, depends on who you think holds the power to legitimize the marriage and the succession, king or pope. It is as unclear now as it was back in the day, so let me know in the comments what's your take. Phase 3. The poets have some fun. This phase began when, in the early 16th century, Portuguese society was experiencing the advent of the novel. Poets and writers took this story and transformed it into a Romeo and Juliet type of love story, adding the most fantastical elements of all, like the corpse of the queen being crowned, her hands kissed by the nobles, her blood still visible in the fountain, and her cries that can be heard in the night wind. This is the phase where the marriage and love of Dom Pedro and Dona Inês de Castro leaves the realm of the historical record and enters the realms of literature, fiction and legend. I'd like to conclude this video by saying that I do not care for canonical law and the supremacy of the church, as you might have guessed considering my previous videos. So, in my opinion, Dona Inês de Castro deserves a place in the long list of queens that marked the story of Portugal. And the fictionalized story of her love with Dom Pedro is a pillar of Portuguese literature and history. Our very own Romeo and Juliet, but better. Their tombs now stand in the transept of the Alcobaça Monastery's church, arranged in such a way that, when Judgment Day comes and their bodies are resurrected, the first thing they'll see is each other. Aww. Thanks for watching and tell your friends about the Weird History Raccoon channel. Please. See you later, alligator.